I've always wanted to create that classic Star Wars scene where the X-Wing rises out of the swamp on Dagobah, Yoda showing Luke just how to use the Force. And I did do it on a live stream, but if that all seems a bit long for you, this is the short version. So the start of this epic scene was a plan. Drew out where everyone was going to stand, where the logs were going to go, where the trees were going to go, and then I just had to build it. Simples. This is quite thin sheet insulation, very common in the UK. Comes with aluminium foil, rip it off and you can carve it with a kitchen knife or box cutter. I used hot glue and just normal kitchen foil to create this scene. So far so good. Needs a little bit more filling in though. Now with hindsight, I should have put something in the foil to make it a bit stiffer. But in my defence, it's only a thin bit of foam, so there wasn't much to attach it into. So when I did this stage, all my trees started to lean forward. And this stage is adding paper mache. It's art mache. I used Celluclay at the beginning, but I quickly ran out of it. It's just something off Amazon, art mache. It's like paper fibres, cellulose fibres. I suspect there's a glue in there. I added extra PVA glue so it won't crack as it dries, because it dries by basically shrinking out the water. Having foil underneath that's not too firm helps because that just scrunches up a little as well. So a lot of time spent adding paper mache. And when I say a lot of time, I mean days. And once the first lot had dried, I sorted out some of the sagging trees. Yep, propped it up. And then more foil to fill the gaps. And after that, you guessed it, more paper mache. This is not quick because it takes a long time for the paper mache to dry, but it is actually really safe for kids. Foil and paper mache, you can't go wrong with it. Time to add all of those vines you see hanging around everywhere in a swamp. And I have a box of jute string. I actually bought some more as well, in loads of different sizes, some of it almost a rope. All of it really useful because you can unwind it and twist it and put it in place, and it's like a vine. I mean, it's jute, it's a natural product, and if you tweeze out the ones that have a really big twist in them, even the twist doesn't show. And many hours later, you have a bunch of wild-haired trees. Need to get the vines to stick a little bit more to the front, like they're clinging on. And I thought about using glue, and then I thought, oh, if I use a paint, I can paint them and glue them at the same time. Win-win. So I used this really, I thought it was going to be a nice colour, but it dries quite nasty. It's a little fake looking. It's a house paint I had sitting around from another project. And despite 2 coats, I still missed a few spots. To get into all those cracks and crevices that I just couldn't get into, I mixed up some artist acrylic raw umber paint with water just to thin it a bit, and then dabbed it on everywhere. It all looked a little bit samey at this point, so I went over the tips with this mid-brown. It's a little bit lighter than raw umber. I added even more highlights by dry brushing on this buff titanium. And then it was a little too bright, so I went over it with some dilute yellow ochre, just added into the other colour, just to warm it up a bit. Still not totally happy though. Maybe a black acrylic wash would help settle into those cracks, so I sprayed it with this wash, and I did a whole video on how to make this wash. But no, I was still missing something. So I added a pale, and it dries a lot lighter than this, green water mixable oil wash over the top in the hope that it would flow into the cracks better. That green tint, I think, was what I was missing. So at the end of this, I was happy. And it was time to move on to the ground. Now for this, I used garden soil. My mum had a massive delivery a few years ago and I took a box out. It's really quite sandy stuff, big stones in it. Should have probably sieved it. Sieving would have got rid of all the bigger stones, but I wanted some bigger stones in there, so I just got it out with a teaspoon and put it over a coat of white glue. This is far too thick for that layer of white glue to stick it all. So I sprayed it with a mix of isopropyl alcohol and water. It's about 1/3 isopropyl alcohol, and that cuts down the surface tension. You can use fairy liquid, washing up liquid if you want instead. You might just get a few more bubbles. So now we know our glue will sink in, I spray it with this mix. It's about 1/6 matte Mod Podge. You can use PVA instead in water. It's so dilute because nothing else will get through these fine spray bottles. And once you've sprayed it and got it all nice and sort of glued, it's actually not that glued because it's very thick. So I drip on some extra glue out of a dropper bottle. It's just as thin, but because it's now damp, it won't get disturbed when you drip it. And I do that on the thicker bits to make sure it's all well stuck. Green Stuff World generously sent me these micro leaves. Now, to be honest, I shop at Green Stuff World anyway, so I'm happy to recommend them. I also use one of my favourite products, chamomile tea leaves. I've got to say though, these brown micro leaves from Green Stuff World were perfect and would have done just on their own. They were absolutely just the right colour for what I needed here. One of the things about modelling is knowing when to stop. I should have stopped before the white leaves. And you can tone white down really easily if ever you make the same mistake. Just spray it with a brown wash, which is what I did. But first, I doubled down even more and I put on some chamomile tea leaves as well. Then I just glued them in place. And then because I'm far too impatient to wait for glue to dry, I sprayed on the brown wash. Now I have no idea if these are vines or roots of the trees. They could be aerial roots. But if you look on the video, there's loads and loads of fine dangly bits at the bottom of the trees. I didn't want to put them on before the ground because I'd never get the soil through them. So I decided to do a second layer now. These are really freaky though. I brushed on a dilute paint just to colour them a bit and they started to move. The swamp is nearly done. I just need a few dead plants and as luck would have it, Fabio from Diorama Precipe sent me a massive box of vegetation and in it were these dead grasses. Go check out his stuff. A lot of them are natural and they have amazing structure. I mean, these are just beautiful. They're actual grasses and you can break them up into little clumps and put them in. There's a link down below. To make sure the world continues beyond my diorama, which let's face it, is not that big, I used 3mm and 5mm Foamex. Why the mix? Well, just what I had on my side. To get the paint to stick, I scuffed them up with a sandpaper and I actually did cut them to fit around the trees too. Then all I had to do was paint a backdrop. When I say then all I had to do was paint a backdrop, it took me 5 attempts before I was happy. And then I used oil paints to get the blending and it took about 3 weeks for them to dry. This was not a quick backdrop. Thankfully, I was able to get on with other things in between. Those other things were Luke's X-Wing. Yeah, the whole point of this diorama is it's coming out the swamp, so I need an X-Wing. I 3D printed it, cleaned it up and assembled it, primed it, cleaned it up again, primed it again, and then I pre-shaded it. Now at this point you may need to know what pre-shading is. Basically, you spray on a darker colour underneath your main colour and it shows through. It works well when you're airbrushing because the transparent layers take a while to build up so you can get some real depth to your paint jobs. Now I sprayed a very dilute black over the grey primer and then covered it with layers of white until I got my desired effect. I started to mask everything so I could spray paint the red markings on his wings, etc. And then realised life was just too short. Instead, I just hand painted everything with Vallejo paints. They won't be as smooth, but it's at the bottom of a swamp for a period of time and it's going to be covered with weed. And it's much, much quicker. What's really going to bring this to life though? Well, a good old panel lining, wash, whatever you want to call it. Basically, you put something that's thin and black and it flows into the cracks, brings out all the details that are there and puts in some artificial shadows, I guess you can call them. I'm using a Tamiya enamel wash. I prefer enamels to acrylics for plastic models because they just flow so much better. And when you're finished, you can just take them off with some white spirit if you've got it in the wrong place. With acrylics, once they're dry, you're stuffed. However, this is a very small brush and it took quite a while. Worth it though, as you can see. And then all I had to do was spray it with some clear sealant, clear gloss sealant, to give it a nice shiny wet look. So far so normal. Time to make it look like a swamp X-Wing. I'm putting it on acrylic rods to raise it up. It's been just literally seconds before dragged out of the water, so it's going to be covered in weed and gunk. Now this may look very space age, It's UV resin and it's set using a UV torch. You can use it as a glue. I'm using it because I know it will dry clear. Super glue can sometimes fog clear structures and I didn't want to use anything else. So here we go, UV resin, UV torch. After a while it will set up. Time for weed. I started off by making a batch on a bit of acetate, you can see it on the right there, and it's green polyfibre covered with earth blend wooden scenic turf. I just sprayed glue and sprinkled it on and left it to dry. I just quickly ran out of it though. So at that point I just used the green polyfibre on its own. It gives a slightly finer appearance. In the movie stills there's like detritus on the wings and on the top, so I used the same Woodland Scenics earth blend just to add that. I can change the colour in a bit, but it's the only thing I have with about the right texture. You know, I honestly don't remember gluing it on. I think I just used this enamel wash to stick it down a bit. It gets loads of other stuff gunked on in a minute, so it's not a problem. This is an AK Interactive dark streaking grime, and it just was all too light and green and fluffy, so I started to darken it down with this enamel wash. Despite a liberal coat of more gloss sealant, it just wasn't looking wet enough. It's fine on the areas that are flat, but on the weed, you'd need to put a lot of this on to get it to look wet. I guess I'll have to deal with that in a minute. I must put in a quick mention for Luke, Yoda and R2-D2, all free models from the internet. Actually, I think I did pay £2.50 for Luke. Links are down below, and I just painted them up with Vallejo paints. Nothing particularly special, all hand painted, including R2-D2. Just like the X-Wing, they got a coat of washes, this time a mix of army painter and enamel washes. R2-D2 looks best with the enamels, but I used the thicker army washes on the clothing to add creases. Finally, I glued them on the diorama with a spot of white glue. Hurrah! It's time for swamp water, the best bit of the whole bunch, pouring resin water all over your diorama. Except at the moment, it's just going to come off the front, so I put on the backdrop to hold it all in place. I filled the gap with an acrylic sealant to make sure nothing leaked. Time to test fit the X-Wing, and then I glued it in place. Whilst I was using UV resin to glue it down, I thought, why don't I put this all over my X-Wing to make it look more watery? So that's what I did. And now a word on resins. Some are epoxy, some are urethane. Some will react to the colours you put in them if you don't use the right types. Acrylic paint can be particularly bad for that. Some will just react with your base. This one did. It's smooth cast. I'd spoken to the supplier. I'd actually rung them up and asked for the best product they had for a deep pour water, and they suggested this because it wasn't going to be that deep. It's about an 8-hour set time, so it's not their quickest one, which it gets quite hot. I've got some. It's a casting one, and it was very yellowish looking coming out of the containers, but I knew I was going to make swamp mud out of it, so if it goes brown, I'm not that worried. So I put together a lovely concoction with their proper paint, you know, the pigments they recommend. Yep, all done, and I poured it everywhere. It looked beautiful for about 3 minutes. The first hint things weren't quite right were the cracking noises, and then it just started to bubble. Okay, well, I wasn't sure how to do the scum anyway, and I was going to do scum around the edge, so happy accident. I mean, it's round the edges where the scum would be, and it's set solid. I mean, it's foamy, but solid. Just to be sure though, I did the next coat in epoxyplast, which I've used before in the Pirates of the Caribbean diorama, and it is wonderfully inert and doesn't react with anything, and that base was more or less the same as this base, you know, had tar grout or soil or something like that on it. So this time I poured a much, it's more transparent, let's put it that way, because I didn't have any white tint for this particular type of resin, and I was being very sure about using the right colours. So I just put it in, let it spread, seal all of that misery in. Now this takes 72 hours to set, so on my way home from, I'd obviously been out, look, I've got a leather jacket on rather than a sweatshirt, but I put on a few micro leaves and a few chamomile tea leaves because there's loads of floating stuff in there. I didn't want to put it on at the start because it might sink. I wanted it to be slightly wet, so I put it on now after about 4 or 5 hours. It just kind of sat on the surface. When it was all set up, I inspected the damage. There were a few weird bubbles, which are popped. I mean, they're set solid, but I still popped them. And there was just foamy, weird stuff around the edge. But I wasn't very happy with the colour. It's just a bit pale. There's no great ripples, but there is a bit of turbulence from presumably the creatures underneath going and some splashes coming off the X-Wing. So I just used gloss Mod Podge brushed on to give a little bit of texture to the top of the water. And to green up that froth, let's call it, round the edge, the scum, I mixed gloss Mod Podge, water and some olive green Vallejo paint. I probably should have made it a bit thinner, but I went round the edge and just covered up anything that looked a bit pale and white to try and make it look a bit green, which is actually more the colour when you look at the actual film. And when that was dry, I was done. Thanks for watching. If you want to know how I did the fog, I've got a video on that. And if you want to know more details about Dagobah, I have a whole set of live streams with hours of content for you to look at, including some of the more problematic areas. Don't forget you can support me through Patreon, subscribing, channel membership, whatever floats your boat, or just enjoy watching the videos. That's what it's all about. See you next time.